right, in this set of lectures, I'm going to cover constructs, variables, measurement, as well as research claims. These are basic ideas that sort of ground us in how do we really know what we're talking about when we conduct a psychological study or survey. The reason we need to understand different variable types is because variable type is what lends your analysis in one direction or the other. Basically, different variables can only be analyzed in certain kinds of ways. So I want to make sure we share a language of how to refer to constructs and variables, as well as identify good measurement for our chosen variables to give us a framework for how we're going to start thinking about our research projects. So the basic question is, if we have an area of interest in psychology, how do we pin down what we're actually talking about? The term variable I'm going to use over and over and over because this is basically how we ground ourselves in a common idea of what we're actually talking about. So some definitions of a variable are the quote unquote core unit of psychology. That to me doesn't say very much. To me, a more accessible definition of a variable is our more concrete definition of any factor, characteristic, or phenomenon that we're interested in. It's essentially putting a word or a label on whatever idea we're interested in that gives us an idea of how we could eventually measure it or capture it in our data collection. The term variable is so called because it needs to be something that can vary to at least two levels. The idea is that it needs to be a construct that can exist in different categories or that can exist at different levels along a numerical scale. Let's take something as basic as gender. Gender is a variable because it varies at least two levels. That variable is broken down by, at a minimum, male versus female. A variable could be something that varies, like I said, along a numerical scale. So maybe you're talking about self-esteem. The idea is maybe you can divide people into those with low self-esteem or high self-esteem. Or maybe people are measured on a 1 to 7 point scale. Again, as long as it's something that's free to vary to at least two levels, it would constitute a variable. There's different approaches to how you can incorporate your variables into your research study. A major distinction is between measured and manipulated variables. A measured variable is going to be something that you take a record of how much of a quantity of that variable or what category someone is on a particular variable, assuming that that's a sort of a baseline level or category that they were living in. So, for example, self esteem, you might assume that people have a semi stable sense of self esteem, so you can measure people's self esteem and get an accurate sense of how they fall along the spectrum of self esteem levels. When I say a variable can be manipulated, this is not really the colloquial understanding of the word manipulate. That means, sketchy or duplicitous. This basically just means that it's a variable that's within the hands of the researcher to change something about that variable. So take the same example of self-esteem. Maybe you think that self-esteem can cause changes to an individual. Maybe you think giving someone a self-esteem boost can make them happier, that it can boost their mood. As a researcher, if you wanted to do that, you might give some of your participants a prompt to read that makes them feel good about themselves. And maybe your control participants would not read any sort of a boost, and you could then compare those two conditions. That variable would be manipulated because you, as the researcher, are actively doing or changing something having to do with the variable. Now, in pinning down the variables that we're actually interested in and how we can, in a more concrete fashion, measure them, the idea is you have to go from something abstract to something that you can actually tangibly collect data on. Particularly if you're talking about psychology, the concepts that we're interested in might seem a little bit abstract, like self esteem or depression or memory. All of these sort of seem vague because to start, we just have to think about what the ideas are that we're interested in and put a name on them. From there, though, we have to get a little bit more specific. How actually do we capture these variables we're interested in? This basic process goes from more abstract to more concrete until you actually have a specific idea of how you're going to collect your data. How are you going to measure your variable? So we start with the most abstract with what we call a construct. A construct is the even more vague idea that you might have. The variable is going to be a more specific definition where you conceptualize the levels that your construct can vary to. From there, you try and get more specific in a process that we call operationalization. To operationalize a variable is essentially to ask, how can I measure that variable in a way that makes sense? How can I measure the variable in a way that truly captures what I'm trying to capture? So you might say to yourself, I'm interested in memory. I'm going to give somebody a word recall quiz. Then you get even more specific and you ask yourself how you're going to measure that variable. Well, your measurement might be, how many words did someone remember from a specific list? That would be the basic process, going from construct, in this case memory, to variable, recall, to operationalization, and measurement, which is how many items did people actually remember from a list of words that were presented. So, this idea of a construct, again, this is the most abstract term. This is the hypothetical thing that you're interested in. It's something that you maybe can't necessarily observe directly because it's too broad or abstract, but it's something that you think you can infer from some sort of behavioral or self report sort of a measurement approach. So, something like hunger, attention, depression, these are all things that would have many different ways that you would be able to operationalize them, and it'll be up to you to decide what is within the boundaries of what you can accomplish and what measurement strategy makes sense. So the variable correlate of these constructs, right, it just makes it a little bit more concrete. So you might operationalize hunger as some amount of time since eating. Depression, again, this is something that we can all understand exists, but it's broad enough that you have to ask the question, how can I make depression vary along different levels? You might have it be the presence or absence of a diagnosis, or it might be some more specific correlate of depression like sleep disturbance. Okay, again, this operationalization idea is when you get as specific as possible, and it gives the researcher a bit of a guideline on how they're actually tangibly going to be able to measure the variable. So maybe your operational definition of hunger, once you decide that it's going to be a variable that depends on how much time has elapsed since eating, you might say that the operational definition is actually 12 hours specifically since one ate. If you're thinking something that's maybe even more intangible, like maybe a social psychological construct, like let's say subjective well being, right? Happiness, this is something that we can all understand exists, but we have to infer someone's level of happiness some way that we can tangibly measure. So, if, for example, you take Diener's subjective well being scale, the idea is you ask people a series of self report statements. What better way to get at happiness than to ask someone whether or not they see themselves subjectively as a happy person? To perceive yourself as happy, it makes sense that that would actually go into really being happy. It can be as simple as that, just asking people questions to get the information you're seeking. Again, it's up to the researcher to decide what would be the best strategy for actually measuring this variable. Do you just want to ask people a yes or no question about whether they consider themselves a happy person? A lot of information might get lost there because there might be a broader spectrum of happiness. Maybe there's people who are very unhappy, there's people sort of the middle of the road, and there's people who are very happy. For that reason, often you're going to see these self report scales having a little bit of a breadth to them. It might be on a 1 to 7, kind of a Likert scale. So if you were to follow that link there, that's an example of a self report scale that's meant to give you an operationalized strategy for measuring someone's happiness or well being. The basic framework is going to look a little bit like this. You want to start by identifying your construct of interest. You just want to slap a name on it, right? Is it depression? Is it memory? Is it self esteem? Is it anxiety? From there, you want to flesh out what we call a conceptual definition. So once you have the term named and labeled, you want to think about what does that term really mean. So for example, anxiety is a disorder that causes people to be tense and worry a lot. Depression is a mood disorder. You want to flesh things out with a little bit more of a conceptual definition. You can either do this by doing a background literature review and getting a sense of what the consensus on a conceptual definition is in the literature, but you can also create your own conceptual definition based on your understanding of the construct. But it's always good to lean on pre-existing literature to inform the definitions that you use. From there, Any construct is basically going to have a series of ways that you could actually identify the variables you're interested in. If a construct is broad and abstract, the variable that you can pin down to more specifically measure it, right, you're likely going to have a few options. Then from there, your operational definition is again getting as specific as possible. What constitutes being at various levels along the variable? So to take the example of depression, this process might look like this. You start by labeling the construct of depression, and then you want to make sure to define it so that you have a solid working understanding of what depression means. So again, depression, it's a mood disorder that causes persistent sadness and loss of interest. There's obviously a lot of other symptoms that go into depression. So then from there, the idea is which variable operationalization strategy are you going to choose? You know, depression is a clinical construct. So maybe you assess levels of depression by asking a yes or no question to a participant as to whether or not they've had a diagnosis of depression within a certain time frame. You might know that depression has certain physiological correlates. Certain things go on in your brain that are sort of tells of depression. So you might be familiar with the fact that serotonin is often associated with depression. It appears that individuals with depression might have imbalanced levels of serotonin in their brain. You can measure that with a blood test. That would be one strategy. Or you might take the self-report strategy and take a self-report index, such as the Beck Depression Inventory. So the BDI is a well-regarded questionnaire that helps assess depression by asking a series of self-report questions that gets at multiple different symptoms of depression, including sadness, including loss of interest, including sleep disturbance, appetite disturbance, cognitive disturbance, etc. BDI basically captures all of that in a self-report. Then what you're left with is ultimately going to be your participants' score on the BDI, and that score is what represents essentially their level of depression. So any of these strategies for measuring depression would be perfectly valid. It's just what kind of makes sense for your logistical capabilities as a researcher, as well as sort of your particular perspective. If you're someone who's more interested in cognitive neuroscience, it might be that middle serotonin type level. If you are more of a clinical psychologist, you might go diagnosis or BDI. It just kind of depends on your logistical capabilities as well as your research perspective. So this is the basic process. And this is what you should begin to start doing to give you ideas about what you want to do your research project on. Start by naming the constructs that you might be interested in and try and pin down how you could get a little bit more specific. This process is most easily done by doing a literature review to try and find scales that are meant to assess your variable of interest. Once you start reading these pre-published scales, it gives you more of a solid idea of how measurement is typically done on your variables and constructs of interest. So now I want to talk more about distinctions between variable types and measurement approaches. Again, it's important to have a solid working understanding of variable types because, again, the type of variable you use impacts the kind of data you collect and ultimately impacts the kind of analysis that you are capable of doing. So it's important to be able to distinguish the various types and approaches. So first I'm going to cover the more broad distinctions of types of variables before getting even more specific. So a very broad breakdown of variable types. Some variables are categorical and some variables are more quantitative. This distinction basically is between variables that assess a numerical data point such that the number has an inherent numerical meaning versus a categorical variable that really just places people into different categories. Numerical assignments wouldn't really mean much of anything. By that I mean, let's take the variable of gender, which is categorical. It just places people into various categories. In collecting information from my participants on their gender, they might select 1, and that might indicate that they're choosing that they're a male, whereas 2 indicates that they're a female. But you as the researcher, you could have flipped around those numerical assignments such that 1 indicated female and 2 indicated male. Your analysis would not change whatsoever. The number is just separating the categories. The number is inherently meaningless. A variable like gender is categorical because there's no way to make that a numerical variable. It just places people into categories. Quantitative variables, on the other hand, are going to be where there's an inherent numerical meaning associated with your participants' responses. So I'm going to show you various examples of quantitative type variables, but one basic example would be where you fall along a numerical scale. So let's take that same subjective well-being scale. The idea is that your score on the subjective well-being scale is associated with an actual meaningful quantity of that variable. So high scores on subjective well-being mean higher well-being. The fact that those numbers have inherent meaning in terms of amount of the construct that a participant has, that means that the variable is quantitative. A similarly broad breakdown of variable types is going to be discrete versus continuous. This basic breakdown maps onto categorical versus quantitative, but what discrete versus continuous means is distinct from categorical v quantitative. A discrete variable is going to be where there's no meaningful values in between your adjacent units. So again, gender would classify as a discrete variable. Somebody either falls into one category or the other. Let's say your participants were responding to a question indicating their gender, where a response of 1 indicated female and a response of 2 indicated male. There's no 1.5 on that scale. It just doesn't exist. It jumps straight from 1 to 2. So a discrete variable is going to be where responses exist in sequential units that don't essentially touch each other, right? There's a 1 for female and a 2 for male. There's no space in between those responses. Continuous, on the other hand, is when there's going to be theoretically infinite values that exist between so-called adjacent units. So for example, length. Maybe you're measuring the length of something. I like puzzles. Let's just take puzzles. Let's say you're measuring the length of a puzzle and it says it's 18 inches across. Essentially, that could be a little bit under 18 inches or it could be a little bit over 18 inches. There's theoretically infinite units of length that exist between 17 inches and 18 inches. Something could really, if you had the accuracy to measure it, be 18.00001 inches. The idea is that if you're just measuring something on a ruler, there's theoretically infinite values along that continuous space. Same thing with like reaction time. Let's say we're measuring your reaction time in seconds, and it takes you 5 seconds to run across the room. I measure you as getting 5 seconds, but it's theoretically possible that your time was actually 4.8 seconds or 5.2 seconds. Since the amount of accuracy that I had only was to be able to measure things in whole units of seconds, right? Think about how it's theoretically possible that your actual value could be anywhere along that adjacent space. That's what would make something like reaction time or length be a continuous variable as opposed to discrete. So this quantitative versus categorical breakdown can actually break down to even more specific variable subtypes. These are going to have further distinctions that set them apart, and it's going to be valuable to be able to tell these 4 different levels or scales of variables apart because, like I said, there are different approaches for analysis that are associated with different types of variables. So if we're talking scales of measurement, variables are most specifically thought to exist on a scale from nominal up to ordinal, up to interval, and finally to ratio. These scales essentially go from least quantitative, your nominal variable, up to the most quantitative, which is your ratio. So I'm going to break these down, I'm going to define them more specifically, and I'm going to give you examples for each. Okay, so first understanding what these 4 levels mean. A nominal variable is going to be completely categorical. It's going to be a variable where names are just assigned to the different levels or categories. It's basically not numerical whatsoever. An ordinal scale of measurement is when you're getting a little bit more numerical, but still not completely inherently meaningful numerical responses. So an ordinal scale of measurement is going to be when there's a ranked ordering, but the different levels between the ranks are not necessarily equidistant. Interval, on the other hand, is going to be where there's levels ranking different responses in a certain numerical order, and that there is an equal space in between your intervals. This is going to be distinguished from your most numerical scale in that there's no quote unquote true zero associated with an interval scale. Ratio is going to be the exact same thing as interval, except there is what we call a true zero in the scale. Again, I'm going to break these down with even more detail and give you examples of each. So starting with nominal scale variables. Again, this is when responses do not represent any sort of inherently meaningful numerical value. Responses merely separate people into various categories that they may be a member of. Any numerical values associated with the variables are essentially just arbitrary designations. It places people into various categories, but the numbers themselves don't really mean anything. A classic example of a variable that falls on this nominal scale is again gender, which is a very common categorical variable that's typically included in most surveys, and it should definitely be included in yours. As I mentioned before, to place people into various gender categories is sort of inherently non-numerical. You might code all the men in your dataset as 1 and all the women in your dataset as 2. That's completely arbitrary. Those numbers don't actually mean something. It's just a way to keep the two categories separate. Something like the major that somebody identifies with. Maybe you're polling a group of students on whether they're psychology majors, business majors, basket weaving majors, who knows. The idea is there's going to be a series of categories that people are going to fall into, and you're likely going to want to assign a number to indicate category membership, right? Psych majors get coded as 1, business majors get coded as 2, etc. Those numerical designations, again, are inherently meaningless. Another variable or question that would constitute being on a nominal scale. A question like this, similar to the one that you responded to in your first lecture quiz that just asks you to choose your current favorite area of psychology, right? You all basically just picked a group that you were a part of. There's nothing inherently numerical about the way that I've organized those variables on the list from A to F. I could completely jumble around the order that those responses are in, and it wouldn't change anything about the way I interpreted your answer. So that's what I mean by it's inherently not meaningfully numerical. Ordinal scale, this is going to be variables where the responses represent a ranked ordering, but the ranks might not be equidistant from each other. So that is to say that there is a numerical order that is going to be meaningful for the ranking, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how far apart those various rankings are. So a classic example of an ordinal scale variable would be the placement that you got in a timed foot race. Someone who finishes first in a foot race, second in a foot race, third in a foot race, that ranking is meaningful. It does keep things in a meaningful order. You can't swap out what's first with what's third. First comes first, then comes second, then comes third. What I mean by relative magnitude and not absolute magnitude, though, is just getting people's placement in the race doesn't tell you how far apart these placements were. The person who came in first might have finished way faster than the person who placed second and third, and maybe third came in just behind second. You actually don't get any information about how far apart these rankings are when you just get the ranking. Another example of a variable that might realistically be measured in ordinal scale would be asking people to rank the importance of certain factors in their life in terms of how important they are to you. So asking people to create a ranked ordering for the importance of family relationships, friendships, career success, money, physical appearance. The idea is you want to get a sense of what people value most by asking them to choose their priorities. If somebody chose the ranking of family relationships first, and then friendships, and then career success, that doesn't tell you anything about how much each of those things are prioritized in terms of their absolute magnitude. So it could be the case that one person ranked family, friendship, then career, who thinks that family is way more important than friendships, and friendships are like way past family relationships. their ranking is going to look the exact same as a person for whom family and friendships are neck and neck, super close to each other, but family just ekes out, just beats friendship. There might be a value in having participants rate their responses on an ordinal scale like this. It sort of forces people to choose a certain ranking. But again, some information is lost because you don't know how far apart the different rankings are. It's just placing them in a numerical order. All right, getting up to your more numerical, inherently quantitative scales of measurement. So an interval scale of measurement is going to be when the score that participants give you when they're responding represents a specific numerical value that does have meaning. Additionally, the different choices should represent equal intervals that are equidistant from each other. The idea is that differences to the amount of the response that people are taking needs to represent sort of equal differences in the amount of that variable that they have. So good examples to try and make that make sense because it can be confusing. Something like the Fahrenheit scale of measurement. A single degree on the Fahrenheit scale represents a consistent unit of temperature, right? A degree is a degree is a degree at all along the scale of units on the Fahrenheit scale of measurement. A degree is a specific quantity of heat, and 1 degree represents a consistent unit, right? So the distance, the amount of heat that is changed from 0 degrees Fahrenheit to 10 is the same from 10 to 20. So different units along the scale represent consistent amounts of the property. Another example of this would be time of day. An hour is a consistent unit of time, whether it's the hour from 1 to 2 a.m. or the hour from 1 to 2 p.m. An hour is a consistent unit of time. The same amount of time goes into an hour all along the different hours of the day. One key distinguishing factor that's going to make something interval scale as opposed to ratio, which I'll get into in a second, is the fact that interval scales of measurement don't have what we call a true zero. This is going to mean in practice that variables on an interval scale can have negative values. So to use the example of temperature in Fahrenheit, 0 degrees along the Fahrenheit scale is just another temperature value. There's nothing unique about it. It doesn't represent the absence of temperature. There can be negative degrees Fahrenheit, right? You can blow right past 0 degrees Fahrenheit, nothing unique happens. There can be negative degree values. I used to live in North Dakota. Trust me, it happens all the time. So the scale can include 0, but key is that 0 isn't inherently meaningful as a quote unquote true 0. 0 is just another point on the scale. Okay, so again, 0 degrees Fahrenheit does not indicate the absence of heat or temperature. Also, if you're talking hours of the day, there is such a thing as 0 o'clock. If you're on military time, correct me if I'm wrong, that's just midnight. 0 o'clock does not indicate the absence of time, it's just another time of day. Other examples that you might actually realistically measure. Some standardized tests actually would technically constitute being on an interval scale of measurement. Now, I don't think this is true anymore, and I know most of you likely took the ACT and not the SAT, but you used to be able to get a 0 on the SAT even having taken the test. Basically, every wrong answer on the SAT would dock points from you, so it would have been theoretically possible to get a 0 on the SAT, and it doesn't mean absence of having taken the test, just means you're garbage at the SAT. A lot of Likert scales would technically fall under the interval scale of measurement. Take, for example, that Likert scale I have depicted there to the right. If you're to measure agreement with, let's say, customer satisfaction, and you're measuring it on a 1 to 5 scale, if I was to shift that scale down such that 0 was the new neutral, and the scale ranged from -3 to +3, I haven't really changed much about how I would interpret that scale. It's just now that I have negative values, and that having agreement is positive versus disagreement is negative. It doesn't really change how I would actually interpret the scale, though. So that would, in my opinion, constitute an interval scale, because a Likert scale could be shifted to include zero, even though it's not a quote-unquote true zero. So I keep using this term true zero. Now we're going to get into really what does that mean. Because a ratio scale of measurement is going to be exactly like an interval scale of measurement in that it's inherently numerical. Ranked numerical responses indicate equidistant places along the scale in question. It's just that ratio scale contains what we call a true zero. This means that the scale can only go up from zero because a zero represents the absence of the property being measured. So an interesting correlate to degrees in Fahrenheit is what we call the Kelvin scale. If you remember high school physics, Kelvin scale is a scale of measuring temperature whereby zero on the Kelvin scale represents the absence of heat. It's basically the coldest temperature that can exist. There is no colder than zero on the Kelvin scale. That means measurement of heat in the Kelvin scale contains a true zero. There is no such thing as a negative value, and it can only go up from there. But once you go up from zero, the Kelvin units are consistent along the numerical scale. Other examples of this would be, let's say, income. Income starts at zero and can only go up from there. A dollar is a dollar is a dollar, right? The difference from $0 income to 10,000 is the same amount of money as 10,000 to 20,000. But the scale starts at zero and can only go up from there. Let's say years of experience, right? The day you start your new job, you're at 0 years of experience. Now, the distance from 0 years of experience to one is consistent from 1 year to 2 years, but there is no such thing as negative years of experience. It inherently starts at zero and can only go up from there. So that's what I mean by a true zero. A true zero means that zero represents the absence of the property. So there's no going lower than that. So anything is a ratio scale where it's exactly like interval, but there's no negative values possible because there is a true zero. Okay, so those are your scales of measurement. Hopefully going through the different examples helps. It's always helpful to think of more examples to try and flesh out your understanding, but for now, I'm going to move on to broader measurement types. So once you've decided the variables that you're interested in, you want to start thinking about the specific approach you're going to take for how you're going to take measurements. How are you actually going to collect data? The different approaches are going to fall under what we call observational measurement. This is when you just take observations and you collect the data like that. Let's say you're interested in drinking behavior among college students. Observational research would be going out to Brick Street or going out to left field and just taking an inventory of how many times you see people take a shot, or how often you see people buy a round, or how many people you see who are inebriated. It's up to you to decide what observation you want to take, but the heart of observation is that you, the researcher, are recording down what you see. This can take place in the laboratory. Maybe you have participants in the laboratory and you're taking an assessment of how often you see them engage in a certain behavior, and you, the researcher, marks down what you see. So observational is just going to be any time the researcher records what it is they're seeing. Physiological measure is going to be any time you take information about what is going on with a person's body physically and biologically. So this could be a hormonal assessment where you take a spit swab and measure someone's level of cortisol. It could be any approach for brain measurement, a functional magnetic resonance imaging, a PET scan, whatever it may be. If you're taking physical measurements, that is what we term physiological measure. Another approach that is used very, very often in psychology is going to be your self-report scale. So this is basically just when you ask people a series of questions and prompt them to give the information that you seek. This obviously has its ups and downs, right? If it's a variable that you worry people might not be completely honest about, like let's say you're asking people questions about the extent to which they have racial prejudice or engage in discrimination, people are often not going to be completely forthcoming about the things about them that make them look bad. So there's obviously that downside to it. You want to be thoughtful about whether or not your variable is something that people might be honest on. So, something like self-esteem or depression. You have to ask yourself, is self-report a good strategy? Will people want to be honest on that? It doesn't negate the usefulness of self-report if you're worried about people being honest. It's just somewhat of a limitation. The upside, though, is that self-report is easy, it's efficient, it's cheap, and it's straight to the point. It's a lot easier to do than taking an expensive physiological measurement. It's a lot easier to collect the information just by asking people questions. So anytime you interview a participant or you ask them to respond to a series of questionnaires in a survey, this is going to rely on self-report. So obviously it's not perfect, but it's sort of a great way to get started because it's definitely the easiest approach for collecting data. And now to wrap everything up on this particular set of topics, variables, and measurement, I want to show you an example of how a single survey can incorporate lots of different types of variables. You're sort of not stuck choosing just one or the other. And as I mentioned, different variable types lend themselves to different approaches for analysis. So what I would recommend is thinking about different types of variables that would result from creating different sorts of questions that you might be interested in creating in your own survey. So to use an example that I personally love, I love It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. It is the greatest show that explores terrible people from Philadelphia on television right now. So let's say I'm interested in attitudes towards It's Always Sunny because I'm a scientist. Okay? A nominal question would be maybe who's your favorite character on It's Always Sunny, and you give people a set of possible responses. Right? People can indicate Dennis, Mac, Dee, or Charlie. And maybe I assign those categories as Dennis being 1, Mac being 2, Dee being 3, Charlie's being 4, just so I have numerical information to put into my data set. But those numerical assignments are meaningless, right? It's just a stand-in for a category. Ordinal, again, this is when you're ranking responses, but the distance between the ranks is not necessarily equidistant. So if I ask you to rank the awfulness of these available It's Always Sunny characters, you might say that Charlie is the least awful, Sweet Dee is the second least awful, Mac is third, Dennis is fourth. That doesn't tell you, relatively speaking, how awful one is versus the other, right? You might say to yourself that Charlie and Sweet Dee are sort of neck and neck in both not being particularly awful, right? That ranking that you gave me doesn't distinguish you from someone who's like, no, Charlie is awesome and Sweet Dee is way worse than he is, despite the fact that she's number 2. Okay? So it's all about ranked ordering without the distance between those ranks being specified. Interval, again, this is going to be a scale of measurement whereby there's equidistant numerical separation between your adjacent units. But if there is the possibility for there to be a 0 as part of the scale, or hypothetically possible for there to be negative values in the scale, it would technically classify as interval. So if I ask you to rate the morality of the characters from It's Always Sunny from -10 to +10, right, there's no true 0 there. I could reshift that scale to go from 0 to 20, and it wouldn't really change anything about the way I interpreted that variable. Ratio, on the other hand, I could ask my participants how many years they've been watching It's Always Sunny. That can only start at 0 and go up from there. But the amount of time year to year is consistent, right? The amount of time that you spend watching from year 0 to year 1 is the same as from year 1 to year 2. But you can't have watched It's Always Sunny for a negative amount of time. The lowest response you could have to that question is 0, and it can only go up from there. So I'm going to take a pause here and I'm going to pick back up with reliability and validity, which is going beyond identifying the variables you want to use to identifying how good your measurement is.